Well, hello everybody. This is Dr. Annette Farovich with Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit. And you can find me on the internet at www.healthymindbodyspirit.net. I know I'm recording. I don't know if I'm live. I have a big error message, but it doesn't matter because it's midnight here in Michigan, and that's when I'm recording. And I'm recording at midnight only because I need to get an introduction done, and I'm ready to get the introduction done, so I'm doing it right now. We're getting ready for the holidays, as you can see, which is wonderful. But I wanted to give you an introduction to the part 2 of our new series. Actually, it's not really a new series, is it? It's a series that I had available since last year about this time. I completed it, but it wasn't edited. Now I'm editing the video, so you're able to get this in smaller chunks. But as I said before, I went to edit this video and I actually didn't have a lot to cut out. So what I did instead was I made it a 2-part video. And the second part for this introduction to our edited version for this video series on depression and behavior. Episode number 1 is What is Depression? And this is an introduction to part 2 of episode 1. Is depression due to nature or is depression due to nurture? And so this is a really important question. And it's important for us to understand what we are capable of doing for depression. Remember that I am always a proponent of behaviors that help us with depression. And so, how much is depression, or any personality characteristic for that matter, how much of it is due to nature, due to our biology, right? Due to our DNA, basically. And what we're talking about more specifically then are those things that are unchangeable about us, okay? That is really the important component here. If we believe that things are DNA-based or even chemistry-based, we then exclude the possibility often of having an environmental component that changed that chemistry, that changed our biology, that turned on DNA, that turned on chromosomes or turned off some of them, just like we get our chemistry activated or inactivated, okay? All right, so I wanted to give you some of the science behind what is going on with depression and also what is going on relative to our biological contributions and our environmental contributions. When we talk about environmental contributions, we are talking about those things then that are changeable, right? I'm not saying that we don't often rely on chemistry, right? We often rely on chemistry, and we can stimulate chemistry artificially sometimes. That's what I talk about when I talk about engagement. I talk about trying to stimulate things like dopamine and serotonin and epinephrine. Remember our adrenaline if you watched episode number 1. And so I also talked in episode number 1 about ways that I'm getting engaged during this holiday season. And so I didn't give you the right name. I want to tell you. So I've done a lot of things for Christmas to help me get in the mood and get in the spirit. But also remember that the holidays, it's about the birth of the Christ child, of Emmanuel, our Savior, right? He comes to save us. Emmanuel, he saves. And so, and isn't that our hope for the season? Isn't that really our hope? I wasn't going to necessarily talk about that necessarily, but I have some information out there about Santa Claus, and sometimes I believe that we really, with Santa Claus, really forget who we are hoping to come during this Christmas season. And so getting engaged in all kinds of ways. And of course, for me, I would be telling you that you get engaged mentally, right? So you're not thinking negative thoughts and you're not ruminating. If you watch my series, it's not faking ourselves out either, though, right? It's not faking ourselves out into being happy. It really is a genuine and authentic happiness, and that's part of the lessons that I teach. So being engaged, again, I gave the wrong name of the YouTube channel, and it was not Guns N' Roses. Of course it's not Guns N' Roses, because that's the rock band has that. It is Glue Guns N' Roses. And so if you remember, I did a couple of these, actually more than a couple. I did 7 of them. And I just did, you know, I outlined it. I really did a few other extra things on this. But again, remember, crafting is being crafty, and being crafty is using things that you might have. I'm maybe older than some of you, so I've got a lot of these things. And even with my tree, all that I did with my tree, I told you last time I really liked this tree, but all that I did was I took my tree that I bought last year, that's a lighted tree, so I didn't have to constantly kill new trees, right? Just for the holiday. And all I did was then I stuck a bunch of red things in there and literally just looked at it and stuck them in there and then spread those things out or whatever. And you can see I have all kinds of things. Some of them I did have to purchase, but most of them I purchased at the dollar store and just shoved them in there in places that I thought that they looked really nice. So crafting, being crafty, right? And I wanted to show you one more thing because I didn't get Glue Guns N' Roses right. I wanted to get it right. And I wanted to show you one more holiday thing that I was doing while getting engaged. I hung it up over here because it was hanging up outside and I had to bring it inside. And so this also was something from Glue Guns N' Roses. And this was just one of those 3D wreaths that I actually got from Dollar Store. I'm not sure if there are better options because it was a little awkward, but that's part of crafting, is trying to figure it out, right? It wasn't as easy as I thought it would be to wrap this around. It kept slipping off and it's not a very solid thing. But you do it a few times in the middle and you get the hang of it. And then just bought this and glued this on, right, and had lots of ribbon that I had, and then got this at the dollar store and hung it. And then these lights were so cheap. I think I got these at the dollar store as well. So so now I've got, and I made 2 of these. So I love that. And you know, there are a lot of hard things that I'm going through. If you watch my mystery series, I hope you are watching my mystery series. There are a lot of hard things that I'm going through. And so this helps me get my mind in the right space where it needs to be. So look at my website, www.healthymindbodyspirit.net, and find out, get your mind healthy, get your spirit healthy, and your body gets healthy, and it makes you more motivated to get your body healthy. Thank you for joining me for this little introduction. And what I'm going to do then is this introduction will go into the nature nurture video that I have. So part 2 of what is depression, and focusing on concepts that have to do with nature and nurture and how we determine those things scientifically. All personality traits have a nurture component, an environmental component. They have a nature component as well. Okay, they do. But most of us can see that nature component is much larger than. So watch this part 2 that I'm obviously making way too long already, okay? It's a short 20-minute, less than 20 minutes, and I don't want to make it extra long for you. So watch part 2 on nature and nurture to help us better understand what is depression, part of my Depression and Behavior series. Thanks for joining me. Happy holidays. Okay. Now, what I want to move to is a better understanding of what is involved in depression. So we know that there's a nature aspect, because what they've been trying to do is they're trying to get rid of depression by changing our chemistry or our biology, or in some way changing our makeup, right? So what we know is obviously that there is a nature aspect to it. But what we see here is that there is also a nurture aspect, and that the nurture aspect or the environmental aspect to any personality trait is key. So I'm going to explain this to you, and this is where we're going to continue to move on then, is looking at what we call an interaction between both nature and nurture. What we see there is we see that individuals have what we call two different, what are called alleles, and they are genes on a chromosome is what they are. This is a gene, one gene from the mom and one gene from the dad. Okay, so these are genes is what they are, just specific genes. And specifically, these genes are called short. S is short and L is long. And so what we see here is we see that we end up getting one of these from each one of our parents. Let me just show you just a little bit on how this works, and then we're going to go back to that a little bit. All right, so what we see here is that Gregory Mendel, who is the father of modern genetics, was taking a look at crossbreeding a green pea with a yellow pea. And what he found out was 3/4 of the peas ended up being yellow peas, and only 1/4 of the peas ended up being green peas. And he wondered why that was. And so what he ended up doing was, again, crossbreeding peas to find out the different types of possible outcomes. And what he then described was that we end up having dominant genes that are expressed. So if we have a child with brown eyes, we know that somebody has a dominant brown-eyed gene. So here you can see a list of dominant traits that if they are present, they will be expressed. And here are a list of recessive traits that if they are expressed, there is no dominant gene. If I have red hair, that means I have no brown hair, I have no blonde hair gene. I only have the recessive red hair gene. Okay, and so we can see how this goes here with the dominant trait being the yellow and the recessive trait being the green. When we combine those traits from a parent that has both dominant yellow and recessive green, we see the potential outcomes, and that is 75% yellow. Here I've got two yellows, right? One from mom and one from dad, two yellows. Here I've got a green from mom and a yellow from dad. But because yellow is dominant, yellow is being expressed. Here I've got now a yellow from mom and a green from dad. Because yellow is present, yellow is expressed. Here I've got a green from mom and a green from dad, and now here is where green is expressed. And so what they've done is they have figured out all of the different possible gene combinations that we can have by using Gregory Mendel's method for determining genes. Now, let's take a look at a little exercise. So if I have Jenny and Rob, and Jenny has dimples, but Rob does not, then what we can see here are the different possibilities for your offspring to end up having dimples. So Jenny has dimples, and dimples is the dominant trait. So here we can see that Jenny could have two dominant genes, one from her mom and one from her dad, or she could have a recessive gene, one dominant from one parent and a recessive from the other, and still have dimples. Rob, because he doesn't have dimples, has a recessive D gene, so no dimples for Rob. What are the chances that their offspring is going to have dimples? Well, we take a look at this, and we just basically combine a gene from Jenny and a gene from Rob. And we can see here then, these are all the possible offsprings if Jenny has dominant genes from her mother and from her father. We can see that the possibilities here for the offspring are 100% that they're going to have dimples. It's only if Jenny ends up having a recessive gene that she ends up then having a 50% chance that her children will have dimples. So here we have 100% chance for dimples if Jenny has both dominant genes, but if Jenny has a recessive gene that matches up with Rob's recessive genes, there's a 50% chance for dimples. All right? So that gives us a really good idea of how we end up getting our traits from our parents genetically. Now let's go back to these interactions. So what we have here is we have these genes. A single gene is called an allele from the mother, S, and from the father, S. Here we can have a possible combination of the mother S and the father L, or it could be the father S and the mother L. Doesn't matter. These are the only combinations that we could have of these two alleles, or LL. What they stand for is the S is for short allele and the L is for long allele. What we know is that this short allele that we have here means that these individuals are genetically predisposed to being depressed. Those that have long alleles, they are not. Those individuals in between can possibly be predisposed to depression. But when we look at this chart more closely, what we see is that even individuals who got both short alleles from the mom and from the dad and have a genetic predisposition then to being depressed, they did not get depressed if they didn't have the environmental component, maltreatment. So it did not matter what these individuals' genetic makeups were if they did not have the environmental component that led to depression, maltreatment. When they did have probable maltreatment, this is where we begin to see genes are making a difference. Severe maltreatment is when your genetics made the most difference in whether or not you had a major depression episode. So of course, this is really important and really key when we've spent so much time on things like understanding gene contributions and our genome. As scientists, we have what's called the Human Genome Project. And this project spent a lot of time trying to determine all of the possible genes that we have in our bodies. And in this way, what they did was they wanted to eradicate disease. We want to think very seriously about this. And so in this way, this is a medical table so that you can see whether the likelihood, for example, that you might get a disease. Well, that's what they did in the Human Genome Project as well. What they did was they looked at family medical trees and they determined, just like Mendel did, when there was a 25% chance outcome for them to get, or that they got a disease. So 1 out of 4 children got the disease, right? And they watched that pattern. So they knew who carried that gene and how likely was it. And then they identified those genes when they found out who was carrying those genes. And that was a Human Genome Project. And again, the idea here is that if I can find Alzheimer's, for example, on your genome, well, then I can manipulate, do genetic engineering in order to eradicate Alzheimer's because I know where it is on your genome. Well, that's all great in theory, but of course the problem is that it's an environmental component that activates it. And so there is, if I begin to alter your genome, there is no guarantee you will end up getting Alzheimer without the appropriate environmental component. And this is why we focus on depression and behavior, not depression and genes. Even if we see that a grandmother and a mother, or how about a great-grandmother and a grandmother and a mother and a daughter, all are depressed. And so we say there must be a genetic component. However, what we know is that there are behaviors that the great-grandmother learned that changed her chemistry, that changed her biology, and that's what she passed on to the grandmother, who then acted in the same ways that then instigated and activated those same kinds of behaviors and consequences that she then taught to her daughter, the mother, who then taught to her daughter, right? So that is in the same way how we can see this environmental component actually becoming the greater variable when what are we doing with depression, but studying it in the laboratories and trying to understand it in the laboratories. So we are looking, when we study the nature or our biological contribution to depression, we are looking at things like certain dominant traits that we have. And we find out those dominant traits through twin studies that we've done. And so here you can see just some data on some of the twin studies that have been done. But the purpose for showing you this data is just to show you that the methodology that we use when we collect data. So what do? We compare identical twins, which here are monozygotic twins, identical twins to non-identical twins. And how do we compare them? Well, we compare them here. We've got identical twins with which are monozygotic, compared to fraternal twins, which are dizygotic. And then we looked at them when they're biological siblings, half siblings, and then also adopted siblings. So what we're trying to do is we are trying to look at identical twins that are raised apart, along with identical twins that are raised together. That's what we have here. Because when they are raised apart, identical twins share 100% of their DNA. We see here that in family studies, we can see that siblings share about approximately, on average, 50% of their DNA. They also share that with their parents, but 25% with extended family, right? However, again, monozygotic twins that have been reared together share 100% of their genes. So anything that differs between the two of them is due to an environmental component. And that's how we end up figuring out, using mathematical computations, what our heritability is. And heritability is our genetic contribution, along with what they call environmentability. And that is just the contribution of the environment then. And what we see here is that our environmental contribution has to do with a combination of shared environments that we share with our family, along with non-shared environments that we get involved in with our peers and people who are not our families. And what we do is we mathematically figure out then the amount of genetic contribution that we see with any personality trait. As you can see in this case, we're looking at the personality trait angry emotionality, right? So we can see that what we are looking at are correlations there. So identical twins are correlated about 0.37 on angry emotionality. What does that mean? Well, we can see that those that are dizygotic or fraternal twins, raised apart or raised together, have a lower correlation. So identical twins that we know are identical should share 100% of their genes, but we see that they do not. So there's an environmental component. What we find out for environmental components is basically that 30 to 50% of our personality traits are genetically based, and the rest of that, so approximately anywhere from 50 to approximately 70% of our personality traits are changeable, are due to our environments. So I want to say that one more time. So about 30 to 50% of any personality trait, like anxiety, like depression, has a genetic component to it. The more that it is personality based, though, the less likely it is that it's genetically based. So, for example, extroversion, we know that personality trait is highly definable and is closer to approximately 50% of that is genetically based. In other words, fixed or unchangeable. But when we look at something like aggressiveness or depression that has a lot of environmental variables that affect it, typically you're closer to about 33% of a genetic component and approximately 70% of an environmental component. This again is the reason why I'm focusing on behaviors, because those are the things that we can change, and when we learn to change them, we end up feeling like we have more control over our environment. Okay. This is Dr. Annette Farovich. So thanks for joining me. Happy holidays.